My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be.
Quoting U.S. senators from both parties, Donald Trump's actions yesterday were, quote, appalling and shameful, shocking and sad, damaging, and a threat to American democracy. Or as John McCain put it, one of the most disgraceful performances by an American president in memory. Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. Today is Tuesday, July the 17th, and what we saw yesterday was shocking. It was appalling. John Meacham, yesterday we had a president who stood on the world stage, and he had an opportunity to show fealty to our republic. Instead, what he showed was fecklessness towards Russia. He had a chance to show courage in the face of a tyrant. Instead, he showed cowardice on that world stage where the president looked like a weak, dumpy stooge to a KGB spy. He had a chance to show loyalty to the men and women in uniform of America's military and intel community, and instead he betrayed them time and again. And instead, he said that he trusted Vladimir Putin's word, and by extension, the word of Russia's spy community, which attacked the United States of America. So many things were said yesterday, John. So many concerns, not only by the usual suspects in the Democratic Party, but also by an awful lot of people in what is now the Trump Party, the Republican Party. I know there's no way to ask you for a parallel because there is no parallel. FDR, after Pearl Harbor, didn't deny that there was an attack. George W. Bush didn't deny al-Qaeda's attack on September 11th. But Vladimir Putin attacked American democracy. We've got the forensic evidence. It's there for all the world to see. Every reasonable, rational person looks at that material just like they can see the DNA on a gun, and they know who did it, when they did it, how they did it, why they did it. You could actually take judicial notice in every court in America that Vladimir Putin's Russian spy agencies tried to undermine American democracy, as Dan Coates says, the president's DNI director, on a daily basis. And yet yesterday, Donald Trump defended Vladimir Putin's spy agencies instead of his own. Where are we right now in the summer of 2018?
There's a live and open question whether the President of the United States is putting the national interest of our national interest ahead of that of a foreign power who may have leverage over him in some way. And without that explanation, you have to wonder what possibly could be going on, what could be the possible motivations along the way. Was it simply pride? Does he simply not have the capacity to see beyond in his own mind, the so-called legitimacy of his own election? Or is there some larger issue here? And my chief fear is that this is the middle of the journey, not the beginning and not the end, because Vladimir Putin has a huge check in his pocket ready to cash from Donald Trump. And I don't think it's simply going to be cashed for a congenial press conference. I think there must be some other shoe to drop, to use that image. There must be some other country to invade. There may be some other attempt here by the Russians to expand their influence at the expense of the West, at the expense of the Western alliance. And we have seen over the last, not just the last 24 hours, but the last 6-7 days, that the President of the United States does not have the interests, historic interests of the Western alliance and of the United States front and center.
And Willie Geist, my father, grew up reading books a series of books called None Dare Call It Treason. None may dare to call what Donald Trump did yesterday treason. But one thing we can say is this. Faced with overwhelming evidence that, again, any court in America would take judicial notice of, that Vladimir Putin tried to undermine American democracy in 2016 and continues to act in abhorrent ways that our Director of National Intelligence says poses a threat for the upcoming election. Donald Trump sat there and was obsequious to Vladimir Putin. And as we've been asking on this show, as I've been asking, I won't bring you in on this, but we all know that Vladimir Putin is holding something over Donald Trump. We do not know what it is, but we know it must be something extraordinary, because no rational politician, no rational president would act this way if he weren't being blackmailed on some level.
Well, that may be true, and we have to entertain that possibility now. The other part of it is what John alluded to, is the vanity question, which is that any implication or any suggestion or any evidence that shows that President Trump's election in 2016 was anything other than legitimate is a blow to the president's ego, and he can't stand that. And he's willing to stand next to the president of Russia and say, I take your word over that of my intel committee so it doesn't undermine my election.
Right, but Willie, here's the thing. It wasn't just about the 2016 election. We first hear on Morning Joe in December of 2015, a year before the results of that election were called into question. We asked him repeatedly why he said Vladimir Putin was a strong leader. I said he assassinates journalists, he assassinates politicians, he assassinates others. Donald Trump's defense of Vladimir Putin was, well, American soldiers in Iraq killed a lot of people too. So even before the election was called into question, he was like a scared child, afraid to criticize Vladimir Putin. That was 3 years ago.
Yeah, there's no question about it. In the context of yesterday's press conference, though, asking about that, I think, again, he can't say anything that makes his election look anything other than legitimate, because it's about his ego. And I want to be clear for our viewers again, Joe, what exactly the Intelligence Community assessment stated. It was dated January 6, 2017. This is what the president says he does not believe. Quote, we assess Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential election, plain and simple. So, yesterday, DNI, Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, had to put out another statement of his own after what the president said, reiterating that the intel community believes that Russia interferes and has evidence that Russia interferes in elections, and specifically interviewed in the 2016 presidential election. So the evidence is all there. The president of the United States chooses not to believe it, and said so, Joe, yesterday.
Well, you know, Willie, the thing is, this is, and we also saw it when the intel chiefs went to Capitol Hill.
Yep.
And I know that even Donald Trump supporters know by this point that Vladimir Putin has something over Trump. I know they know that. They may try, some of them may be trying to deny it, not many. But what's so telling is, while let's just say the last holdouts are talking about the deep state here, it was Donald Trump's intel chiefs that Donald Trump appointed himself.
That's right.
That drew that conclusion on the Hill. It was the FBI director that Donald Trump appointed himself. It was the director of national intelligence that Donald Trump appointed himself. It was the then CIA director that Donald Trump appointed himself, Mike Pompeo. It was, you name it, all of the intel chiefs that drew this conclusion. They were all appointed by Donald Trump, and they were all confirmed by Republicans in the United States Senate. There is no doubt, there is no question, especially after Friday's indictment, that the Russians tried to subvert American democracy, and we have all of the evidence. Forget about CSI New York. This is CSI Moscow, and we have all of the DNA and it's all over Vladimir Putin's bloody hands.
And by the way, the DNI, Dan Coats, said all this on Friday before the summit, hoping to avoid what we saw yesterday. He said the red lights are flashing, they're blinking. We know what's happening. Russia continues to interfere in our elections. Let's bring.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.